Christian, Michael, and other authors, contributors, Anna, Andrea, Sassan, Nico, Markus, Anke and Anna. I wouldn't take more time to introduce them to you because we are all familiar with them and we have all seen their bios from our invitation email as well. So now I will just let you know that our event will last for 90 minutes and 40 minutes of the discussions which will be recorded. 45 minutes of question and answers, which will not be recorded, so please feel free. And then we will close the event. I want also to thank everybody who have expressed their interest to join us. Thank you, everybody, for your time and interest. We all appreciate that, and it's a great pleasure to see you all. So now I will give the floor to Michael to give a brief outline of the special issue. Also, I would like to kind of ask you for muting your microphones during the event. And obviously, you will all have a chance to give your questions by typing them into the chat box or raising your hands during the question and answer session. Thank you, everybody, again, for being here, and I hope that you will all enjoy the event. So, floor is yours, Michael, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me also welcome you all together, very warmly from my side. Thank you all for joining this event. I look forward to a set of interesting presentations and I guess our very lively debate. Let me just start out by saying essentially two things. That this special issue is an outcome of an interdisciplinary research group that has been established and financed by the German Research Association. And it has actually quite a long history. I think I just checked emails before this event here, and it goes back to 2010 or 2011, something like this, with a set of workshops with the University of Hamburg and with Antje Wiener, one of the editors of the journal, as an organizer of those things. That was a very promising start, and then from a certain point on, we decided to go parallel paths, but of course always in close interaction. The group was then financed, I think, from 2016 on from the German Research Association, and it consists of 6 or 7 projects. And what we essentially achieved is a sort of a common conceptual framework with which we also still work on establishing a set of cases, of about 80 cases of those interface conflicts that can be then also used by others for more quantitative analysis. This special issue here, after Fragmentation by Global Constitutionalism, is an outcome of this project. Not the only one, but of one of the major outcomes. And I mean, you all see here this wonderful overview. Let me just say it is it consists of 4 parts after the introduction that essentially contains also the framework that I was talking about. Christian will present this. We will then move not in this presentations here, but the special issue then contains a set of issues that essentially respond to the question under what conditions interface conflicts arise. Then there is a set of issues about the question even how interface conflicts are managed. There's then a final contribution that also tackles the question about the possible effects of interface conflicts on global order. And then in addition to this, the special issue consists to commentaries by Karin Alder and by Siddharth Malabarapu. That is the design of the whole thing, but I just wanted to tell you the context with this research group as the place where this all emerged from. And with this, and without further ado, I just pass on to Christian.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen quickly. Okay. Can you all see this and hear me? I hope so. All right. Thanks a lot, Aigun, also for the introduction and for organizing this roundtable. Thanks to GlobCon for publishing this special issue, and to everybody for showing up. It's my pleasure to give a quick presentation of the introduction to the special issue after fragmentation, co-authored by Michael Zürn and myself. We situate this whole special issue in the literature between fragmentation and regime complexity. Fragmentation is a framework applied in international law scholarship in particular. It refers to the expansion and dispersion of international law and judicial authority in a non-hierarchically integrated manner. And in this literature, quite prominently, we believe is an assumption of incompatibility and conflict. That is that quite often the idea is that the fragments of international law and the different judicial authorities that are dispersing internationally will create incongruence and potentially not only overlapping but conflicting verdicts. And this, so the argument goes, is threatening the integrity of international law and international order in general. That's also why fragmentation is often pitched as the opposite to constitutionalization of international law and order. The regime complexity framework in political science has a rather similar starting point, namely showing that there is a growing number of overlapping institutions worldwide that create such regime complexes which govern particular issue areas or subject matters. And here the main thrust of the argument is that regime complexes allow states to strategize across institutions. That is, they allow for forum shopping, regime shifting, competitive regime creation, all these things that label under contested multilateralism nowadays. And here too, there is often at least a more pessimistic assumption about the effects on international order, as the argument is that regime complexity might undercut institutional order by allowing states to play international institutions off against each other. And so while these two strands of literature most certainly have provided a rich research program in their disciplines, we also think that there's some questions that remain unanswered. There are some gaps here. The main problem probably that we identify in this introduction is that somehow we feel that both approaches, international law and political science, do sort of jump to conclusions a little bit regarding the starting point of overlap and norm collisions, and then say, well, this is going to lead us down a path towards disintegration and disorder. However, we would argue that, sure, overlap and inconsistencies exist, but they are not equal to manifest conflicts among actors. So we argue that it is far from settled theoretically and empirically to what extent overlap and inconsistencies actually lead to conflict. And secondly, even if there is manifest conflict between actors that use these different overlapping norms and institutions, that does not necessarily mean that we are bound to go down this path towards disorder. It is also far from settled whether and to what extent conflict cannot be managed to create another kind of order and not necessarily disorder. And so to address these main gaps as we see them in the literature, we introduce the interface conflict framework. And that means in particular that we zoom in on the micro level of conflict between actors. That is the main concept that we develop in the introduction, that of interface conflicts. We define interface conflicts as incompatible positional differences between actors about the prevalence of two or more norms or rules emanating from different institutions. And based on that core category, our unit of analysis, if you will, we asked two main research questions that Michael already addressed in his introduction, namely, when do interface conflicts come about? When do they arise? And if they do, how are they handled? With regard to the first question here. I think the contributions to the special issue paint a very interesting picture. Namely, first of all, that we see that the world is full of norm collisions and overlaps, but it is not that full of interface conflicts. So the ratio of interface conflicts arising from these potentials of norm collisions and overlap is much smaller than it could be. And as, for example, the contribution by Gholiagha et al. Insists, norm collisions and overlaps are often dormant before they get activated. And also what we see is that activation often happens for political reasons, maybe for instrumental reasons, which means that the problems that arise from fragmentation and also from regime complexity potentially are not unintended or even unavoidable side effects of any structural features, but they are political choices by actors to actually go into conflict, which also conversely means that there is a potential for a political decision not to enter such conflicts. And that leads to an observation and an argument made forcefully by Benjamin Faude and Julia Fuß in the special issue, that overlapping institutions actually often avoid such conflicts through preemptive interinstitutional coordination. Regarding the second research question of how interface conflicts are managed, we first distinguish conceptually between non-cooperative and cooperative conflict management. Non-cooperative conflict management pertains to all those instances in which both parties or all parties to the conflict act in a purely self-interested way with no regard for each other's preferences and where they do not follow any procedural norms or rules. Cooperative conflict management, on the other hand, describes instances in which all parties agree to follow at least some procedural norms and or are willing to accommodate each other's preferences at least somewhat in their own position. That means that they are willing to compromise. And within cooperative conflict management, we also introduce degrees of regulation, where at the highest end of the scale, we would see constitutionalized cooperative conflict management. At the lower end of regulation, a form of decentralized conflict management. In terms of the observations that the contributions to the special issue provide, it's very interesting that hardly any interface conflict in the sample represented here is handled in a completely non-cooperative manner. That is, cooperative conflict management seems to prevail. In terms of the degrees of regulation, it's true that they are mostly decentralized forms of cooperative conflict management. Some are norm-based, few are only constitutionalized. So there is a skew towards lesser degrees of regulation. Finally, in terms of the effects on global order, we obviously do not have conclusive answers and empirical material to say this is what global order will look like or does look like right now. But what we think the special issue does is to put emphasis on the potential order generating effects of conflict and conflict management, an argument that also Nico Krisch and colleagues make forcefully in their contribution. On the other hand, though, the normative substance of all this potentially emerging interinstitutional order, we think is indeterminate, at least indeterminate. Interface conflicts often are brought about in order to challenge liberal norms or Western predominance, which includes the possibility or even the likelihood that the order emanating afterwards is skewed somewhat less liberal than its previous status quo ante. And so to conclude, maybe our view would be that the global governance system might be more orderly than skeptics think, or might become more orderly, but it might also be less liberal than constitutionalists hope. Thank you very much. And also, I need to apologize and excuse myself because I will have to leave for teaching obligations quite soon, but Michael is there to answer all open questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this great introduction, and also Christian for this very informative presentation. So the group of presentation will be by Sassan, Anna, and Andrea. So you can start, Sassan.
Okay, just the usual question. Can you hear me and can you all see the screen now?
Yes.
Just yes,
We can
no?
hear you and we can see. Yes, we can hear you and we can see you.
Okay, excellent. Great. Together with Andrea Liese, I have the honor to briefly present our article in the special issue entitled Activating Norm Collisions, Interface Conflicts in International Drug Control, and our third co-author, Anna Holzscheiter, will join us a bit later today, so she'll be here for the Q&A as well. Our article and the project collisions within the Mosaic research unit Michael briefly talked about in the introduction is built on the insight that norms can and do coexist without being challenged, even though, as researchers, we may regard their behavioral prescriptions to contradict each other or see potential for a collision. We therefore employ an internalist perspective on norm collision, something that is also developed in the introduction of the special issue. And offer detailed conceptualization of norm collisions more generally. What does an internalist perspective refer to? An internalist perspective means that we ask if actors perceive two or more norms as colliding, and in doing so, we distinguish between three types of norm collisions, if you want. What you see on the screen now is taken from our article and gives an overview of these three types. So we distinguish between dormant norm collisions, in which only one actor perceives two norms as applicable to but as incompatible with regards to the expected behavior, and an open norm collision where collision is intersubjectively perceived as problematic and where the collision is articulated by at least two actors, potentially many more. And then, of course, in line with the special issue, this can lead to interface conflicts when at least one of the norms is associated with an international authority. And what we focus on, basically, in our article is that change from dormant to open to an interface conflict, which we call the process we call activation. Well, why does this matter? Because, and Christian just alluded to this in his presentation, not all dormant norm collisions, not all potential collisions make it into the open, either in form of an open collision or a norm an interface conflict, right? And this indicates that the explanation for the emergence of norm collisions cannot be sought in structural conditions alone, right? Such as fragmentation of international law, regime complexity, institutional overlaps, proliferation of norm. That alone does not suffice. And thus we ask in our paper, under which conditions and how do actors activate norm collisions and interface conflicts? And in the paper, we make a threefold argument. First, we hold that without the articulation of a norm collision by at least one actor, norm collisions cannot be observed. And only if those collisions are then perceived by others as problematic as well, they become socially consequential. And this means first that agency matters when we study norm collisions, and agency matters for the emergence of norm collisions in international politics. And second, norm collisions must be activated to become socially consequential. And the third argument we make is that the activation of all norm collisions depends on certain scope conditions. And in our article, we assess three scope conditions and their effect of the emergence of norm collisions in the issue area of international drug control. First, changes in the quality of norms and the legal quality of norms, specifically precision and obligation. Second, changes in power structures and actor constellations. And third, the participation of advocacy coalitions in international negotiations and debates. And with that, I'll hand over to Andrea, who will provide us with some more detail on our case study and also provide some concluding remarks.
Yes, thanks a lot. Can you all hear me?
Yes,
apparently, yes. Okay, wonderful. So I won't lose any time. In our case study, we look at international drug control as an issue area in which we have identified many dormant norm collisions, as Sassan just mentioned, some activated ones and only one interface. Examples for the many dormant norm collisions include a collision between drug criminalization norms on the one hand and norms prohibiting inhuman and degrading treatment and punishment on the other, or a dormant collision between the norm on the eradication of illicit crops and environmental protection norms. And as Sassan mentioned, we are now interested in the activation of some of these dormant to open collisions. And we employ process tracing and discourse analysis in order to trace the development over time. And we have looked at a rather long period of time from the 1950s until today. In our article, we put the focus on a dormant collision that turned eventually into an open one and finally an interface conflict. And this is the collision between the prohibition of narcotic drug use on the one hand and the rights to indigenous practices and cultural heritage on the other. And we use the case of coca leaf chewing, a widespread habit in the Andean region, to illustrate this. And for those who are not familiar with these norms, the prohibition of drug use has been codified inter alia in the 1961 Single Convention, while the rights to indigenous practices and cultural heritage have not been legally codified until the ILO Convention 169 in the year 1991, and again later the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in the year 2007. And it is interesting that right from the onset in the 1960s, when the Single Convention was negotiated, we find occasional criticism or warnings that the prohibition of drug use could interfere with human rights, but these are rather vague statements. Also, the question if coca leaf chewing indeed should be prohibited was occasionally challenged, in particular by Bolivia. But this dormant collision never made it into a manifest conflict. And interestingly, in 2009, the long or occasionally reiterated arguments by Bolivia were taken up by several other actors, both state and non-state actors, and this then turned this dormant norm collision into an open one. And following the 2010 years, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues eventually sided with Bolivia against the Commission on Narcotic Drugs and the International Narcotic Control Board, turning the collision into an interface conflict now between different international institutions. And again, this issue is discussed, or this collision is now brought up even in the context of the OAS and the United Nations General Assembly. In terms of the three scope conditions Sassan introduced, we mainly found that the first two played a role for the activation in this case. For one, the norm quality of one of the two colliding norms had changed in terms of the degree of obligation. That is, the norms concerning indigenous rights with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples were over time even considered as legally binding in Latin America. And at the same time, indigenous rights were strengthened at the national level. And only to mention this on top, the ILO Convention 169 has been ratified by quite a high number of states worldwide. Second, we also observed a clear shift in power relations with the influence of the United States as a long hegemon in the international drug regime, declining or initiatives ceding, and other actors, in particular NGOs and IGOs, moving in. Just as an example, until the 2000s, the United States had often used its power and its financial power, for example, towards the World Health Organization, to prevent the publication of critical reports supporting the position of those who wanted to end the prohibition of coca leaf chewing. Our third scope condition, advocacy collision, made no difference for the activation of the collision in this case. Let me briefly come to the conclusions. There are 3 key findings to take home from our paper, we hope. First of all, that we demonstrate that potential incompatible norms coexisted for a while before they were actually brought into collision with each other. This proves that, or we would argue that this proves that our relevance of an internalist perspective in identifying the collision is a worthwhile undertaking in the first place. Second, we have demonstrated that norms do not collide by themselves. So there are several dormant norm collisions in the issue area, which actors never deem so problematic, which don't make it to a fight between different institutions. Third, in the specific case we have studied, the activation of norm collisions only occurred after power shifts had taken place and the quality of indigenous rights had increased. We are now going to continue to compare norm collisions in other issue areas to see whether those scope conditions hold there or not. We will also continue to compare the responses to those collisions, in particular to the open ones and the interface conflict, like the entire research group is doing. And since we are a project that looks at potential and open norm collisions over a long period of time, over several decades, we feel that there is a dynamic from activation of a collision to a response to a reactivation of a collision, something that we would call the heart rhythm of collision and response sequences, and this is what we are also looking at in the future. And with this, we will end, and I thank you for your attention.
So thank you so much, Andrea and Sassan, for this very interesting presentation. And the next group of presentation will be by Markus and Anke.
Yes,
Do you want
thank
to start?
Sorry, can you all hear me? Yes,
yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks you so much to Global Constitutionalism and to all of you devoting your time on a Friday afternoon. So that's really great that so many people of you showed up. I'm presenting the paper Authority Conflicts in Internet Governance, Liberal versus Sovereigntist, that I wrote together with Danielle Funk and Markus Jachtenfuchs, and Markus also here. So we are happy and looking forward to your questions later. So our paper deals with authority conflicts in the area of internet governance. So internet governance is becoming an increasingly central issue, not only empirically, but also in the international relations, political science literature. In the beginning, it was kind of characterized by the dominance of really more technical writing. So a lot of internet like tech geeks writing on the kind of political nature of all of this. But it had this assumption that the internet is fundamentally different from anything else we can observe in IR, basically, due to this very borderless nature and the technical challenges that arise. And the problem was that this really resulted in a missing link to debates in political science elsewhere. And there is now this kind of slow process of more mainstreaming internet governance into political science. What is sometimes missing, though, is an understanding of the interlinkages between specific kind of conflicts and instances and the broader policy trajectory of this very contested area. And in this paper, we aim to address this shortcoming by arguing that authority conflicts in the area of internet governance can be understood as the clash of two distinct spheres of authority. So a sphere of authority is a governance space with at least one domestic or international authority, which is delimited by the involved actor's perception of a common good or goal at a given level of governance. So this can comprise states, IOs, private actors, NGOs, all kinds of actors, and it's really more than just this kind of loose alliance. It really has this idea of a common social purpose. And we argue that on the one hand, we see this kind of strong and still dominant liberal sphere of authority in internet governance that's centered around Western institutions and principles. And on the other hand, we observe an emerging but still pretty weak sovereigntist challenger led by China and supported by also authoritarian states, but also some developing states. And these conflicts between these spheres play out on the macro level of these spheres of authority, the more meso level of institutions, and on the micro level of norms. And so we see, on the one hand, this liberal sphere institutionally has a commitment to private or multi-stakeholder governance, and this really represents the institutional status quo. So mainly the Western institutions that exist around internet governance are what the liberal sphere is all about. And this is based on consensus and deliberation. As Christian said, we see a lot of decentralized conflict management, but that's also due to the nature of the institutions that already exist. In contrast, the sovereigntist sphere really prefers this more kind of intergovernmental nature and wants more of a shift and institutional change to the UN or other non-Western institutions, also, for example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where you have strong state veto power and more than this one country, one vote system. On the level of norms, the liberal sphere really represents this kind of commitment to individual human rights, like freedom of speech, but also this idea of free flow of information, universal values, unfragmented, and this kind of global coherent internet. And in contrast, the sovereigntist sphere on a normative level is more in favor of state rights, information security, so some control over content, territorial integrity, domestic stability, and very prominently, as the name says, national sovereignty. And this idea of kind of national internet segments where states have a lot of control. And we track these clashes between these spheres through a detailed empirical analysis of 4 key instances of conflict. So first, the first UN World Summit for the Information Society, which ended with the resolution of the so-called Tunis Agenda 2005, which really represents this kind of broad policy development. So the first internet governance principles that were developed there. Second, the conflict regarding the reform of the international telecommunication regulations at the so-called Wicked 12 in 2012. So it's really in highly technical issues where we see now kind of a parallel regime development. Third, the United Nations group of governmental experts in 2017 that really tried to determine the applicability of international law to cyberspace, where we see a lot of conflicts and where we also have this kind of parallel regimes happening now. Finally, the contestation of the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime that was developed in the Council of Europe, and where Russia, particularly since 2017, has been trying to shift the regime to the United Nations. And in all conflicts, we can see really how these spheres are represented on the institutional level. We see really that the states associated with the liberal spheres really push for this multi-stakeholder nature. Interestingly, against kind of a more multilateral order, because multilateralism in this context represents something that states, even like Germany, do not want. And then on the other hand, Russia, China, interestingly promoting more UN, more control, more international institutions. And on the level of core norms, we have this kind of key clash between the idea of freedom of speech and this more focus on information security. In terms of outcomes, we see a variety, so from competitive regime creation, for example, in the Budapest Convention, or attempts to do that at least, to these parallel regimes, as I mentioned, and regime shifting. So there's really, everything is happening, but everything is also kind of unclear. So as Nico's cases, we see a lot of iterative processes happening there. To conclude, we really see that the liberal sphere is still dominant, but it's also constantly challenged by the sovereign internet sphere, which still has to find its shape, because the coalitions kind of sometimes shift, and this common social purpose sometimes is not super clear. But there are also increasingly challenges from inside the liberal sphere. So we see conflicts about the institutions, as in the day of the sphere's formation, actually. We see challenges increasingly to the US dominance. One example is the so-called IANA transition, where the US had to give up some control over the institution of ICANN, which controls the domain name system. But also on the normative level, because we see with the Snowden revelations, for example, that data privacy is increasingly a contested issue. And also, very importantly, the liberal sphere suffers from internal weaknesses and inconsistencies. On the one hand, this is really inclusivity. So the UNGGE, for example, is a kind of an elite club. So it's okay that it's being challenged on one hand. And then there's also the question of like very weak political authority. So as I mentioned, you have this discursive multi-stakeholderism instead of like the rule of law, essentially, which is particularly being problematized with regards to the private companies. And then finally, you have an increase of domestic security concerns where some states in the area of content are increasingly trying to assert control for example, to control hate speech or harmful content, and where you can see that the similarity with the sovereigntists is actually kind of increasing. Yeah, I can finish here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anke. Markus, do you want to add any comments?
No, I will only be available for the Q&A. We're done. Thanks.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, Anke. And our next speaker is Hannah. Please, Hannah, can you join?
Thank you very much. I'm assuming that people can hear me.
Yeah.
I see some nodding. Okay, great. So we have heard in the past presentations and also in the introductions that there are basically two main questions that were pursued in the special issue. One, which is under which conditions interface conflicts become manifest in the first place, but then also once they are manifest, how are they managed? And in my contribution to the special issue, I focus on this latter question, and I do so from the perspective of an international lawyer from international law. And I was really interested in the following question. So within this interface conflict framework that our research group has come up with and is pursuing in the special issue, what place does international law occupy within this framework? So how does international law as an entity, as a conceptual entity, relate to this framework? And I want to do two things in my presentation. First, to present my main argument that international law is not a sphere of authority, but rather a management tool that cuts across spheres of authority, and then point to the limitations of this argument, which is really also pointing to the limitations of international law as such, and point to some open questions, and I'll focus on two aspects in particular. But first, so my main argument that I tried to develop in my contribution was that within this interface conflict framework, international law is mainly a management tool that cuts across spheres of authorities. So in the terminology of the special issue that Christian also, do you still hear me? Okay. In the terminology that Christian presented in the very beginning, using a legal argument is a form of regulated interface conflict management. And I want to clarify that this is not a normative claim of any kind. So I don't believe that international law as a management tool is particularly well suited to manage interface conflicts, or that it is better suited than informal negotiations or even ignorance of a conflict. And I also want to clarify that international law does not definitively settle conflicts. It transforms them. So there is a form of management that happens when you invoke legal argument, but it does not provide definitive solutions. And I will get back to this point towards the end. So why do I believe that international law is best characterized as constituting a management tool? Or asked differently, how might we think of international law in relation to the interface conflict framework? So perhaps first of all, why do I believe that international law is not a sphere of authority in its own right? Perhaps it's useful to recall the definition of a sphere of authority at this point. It is defined in the special issue as, and I quote from the introduction, a governance space with at least one domestic or international authority, which is delimited by the involved actor's perception of a common good or goal at a given level of governance. But here's the thing, international law, as I see it, as such, does not pursue any substantive goal, any identifiable social purpose that is outside of the law. So there is a difference between international law as a conceptual entity and something like the sphere of authority of free trade, for example, or the sphere of authority of human rights. I would submit that the kind of authority that law possesses works differently. So the very function of law might perhaps be characterized in that it provides an institutional setting of some sort that is subjected to a formalism that ultimately requires actors to pause and to reflect, not to argue exclusively with the moral balance of their claim, but through a specific form. So then if that is true, if that is correct, what happens when we use law as a management tool is this. It transforms the way in which actors might think about the interface conflict, but ultimately in an open-ended way, and it does not provide a substantive or definitive solution. In my contribution to the special issue, I introduced 3 different dimensions in which this kind of transformation through legal argument happens. I distinguished a procedural dimension from an argumentative dimension and from a substantive or solutions dimension. By the procedural dimension, I mean 2 things. So first of all, there is an institutional side of things. So there are specific institutions that are set up, most importantly, obviously, courts and quasi-judicial institutions. But it's also a shift from the conflict as such. So for example, it's better to have free trade, or it's better to have sort of like environmental protection, to who has a burden of proof, for example. So there are procedural rules that are being introduced into the debate that are not normally there when you only exclusively focus on the substantive interface conflict. Then second, the argumentative dimension, that brings me back to a point that I mentioned earlier, that introducing legal arguments sort of like shifts away a little bit the focus from the substantive issues. You cannot simply say that a rule or a norm is good, morally speaking. You have to argue that it is a rule of law. So you have to introduce a specific formalism. You have to say that it is somehow connected to sources, it has a specific pedigree. And that is what I call the argumentative dimension. And then lastly, the substantive dimension are again a set of secondary rules that are introduced into how we can manage conflict. So conflict resolution rules have been a big focus, but I would submit that in courts, perhaps an equally important rule are rules of interpretation. So harmonization, for example, plays an enormously important role at, for example, the European European Court of Human Rights, and that is a way, sort of like to interpret away, if you will, the underlying conflict. But that is also a management tool, obviously, that transforms the way in which we think about a conflict. So in this sense, there is a transformation of the interface conflict through the use of legal argument. And in that sense, I would submit that international law is a management tool, but it does not provide, again, definitive solutions, because its formalism does not really allow to address the underlying political issues in a definitive way. So that brings me to my second point, which is, where does this leave us? Which are some of the ways in which we might think? So there are, of course, lots of open questions, but I will make perhaps only 2 caveats to my contribution in the special issue, and sort of like that also at the same time constitute perhaps ways of further research. So in my contribution, I focused on courts, and that is, of course, problematic because courts are not the only sites in which legal arguments can be made, and they can only play a limited role in actually solving conflicts. This is something that Jeffrey Dunoff, that I believe has joined us today, has pointed out very forcefully, and I do agree with that. So why did I choose to focus on courts nevertheless? There is a pragmatic reason for that, because I believe that if we want to understand something about law, we courts provide us in a way sort of like a site where legal argument is very likely to happen and where it's easily also distinguishable or more easily distinguishable from other kinds of arguments. And the other point that I would like to address briefly is the lack of a normative stance. And this is something that Karen Alter has pointed out in her very thoughtful comments to the special issue. She says that the special issue is primarily interested in, and I quote her, a positivist enterprise of science in that we are interested in what is rather than what ought to be, and that this is leading to a basically amoral stance. I think that that's right. And in a way, the other commentator, Siddharth Malavarapu, also addressed that by saying that international, by bringing in third world approaches to international law, a 12 perspective. And I would say that international law is limited not only because it cannot resolve a political conflict behind a legal argument, because its formalism does not allow for definitive substantive solutions. It is also limited because its argumentative structure is ultimately a kind of cultural technique that is deeply ingrained in the global north. So while international law might be cutting across spheres of authority, it still might work in very exclusionary ways through its very formalism. So these are but two aspects that I believe merit further exploration, pardon myself, and at least one, namely how international law might play out in a less formal setting, so outside of courts, is something that Nico, Lucy, and Francesco have explored in their contribution. So with this, I will conclude my presentation and gladly hand over to, I believe, Nico, who's presenting that paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for this interesting presentation. I just want to add that I believe, Hannah, you have shared your screen with us. Does everybody see it in a way that I am seeing, or is that fine?
Yeah, but I think
it's not my screen.
Yes. Okay.
It might be Louis' screen, frankly, but
okay, so yes, Louis, right. Okay, so yes, please, Louis, if you hear us, can you please stop your sharing your screen? Because we can see only your screen right now. Yeah. So, okay. Okay. I hope that will stop sharing the screen. But Nico, do you want to start your talk, or? Yes.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I don't know if anybody can see me really, but I only see now rather kind of darkness really on the screen. But
I think somebody else is still sharing their screen, and could you please stop that? I think it's Louis. If you just
right. Yes.
If you just click where your mouse is at the moment, then we'll all be saved from your picture. Just give it a click.
If you please stop the sharing function, which is just at the right head of the screen.
Well, otherwise I have to disinvite Louis for a moment because we need to clear that screen.
Probably it would be a right option, Andrea.
Yeah.
Maybe you can join us again, rejoin, please. Right.
Okay, there we go.
So it worked.
Good. Yes, thank you, Andrea.
Instantly.
It's very helpful indeed. Thank you. So I am very sorry for this technical issue. So Nico is our last speaker in this session. Please, Nico, you can start. Thank you again.
Thanks, and thanks a lot for having me and us in this conversation, really interesting conversation about some of the output of our research group. So I'm going to speak about the paper that appears in the journal that I've co-authored together with Francesco Corradini and Lucilo Rimes. That's from our Geneva-based project in the broader research group. It's on order at the margins, the legal construction of interface conflicts over time. So that already gives it away that we are lawyers in the first place. But we're not only interested in the law, just as Hannah isn't, but we're trying to ask some broader questions on the basis of kind of our more legal perspective, you can say. And really, the main question that I want to focus on in the brief comments today is what order comes out of these interface conflicts that we've been talking about over the last almost hour or so. As Christian has already initially outlined, right, there's a general sort of bias towards disorder. You can say both in the legal fragmentation literature and in the international relations literature on regime complexity. It's a general sense that kind of the multiplicity of different institutions and norms kind of somehow leads from a rule of law that we all hope for to back to a rule of politics or power in a so really transforms the order in a way that is not necessarily desirable. Now, as we've already seen, quite a few of the contributions to the special issue complicate this picture pretty clearly, right? In the question of how interface conflicts are produced, even if norms are in collision, how they are managed, and the like. Now, what we're trying to do is, in our paper, to complicate the picture in a particular way by seeing interface conflicts not as snapshots, but as evolving over time. And what the outcome of that shift in perspective is. Because we think that one of the causes of the general bias towards disorder in the literature is that interface conflicts are seen in a snapshot, in sort of different institutions or norms working against one another, and compared then to a picture, a more idealized picture, in which no such conflict exists. Now, we argue that if we take a step back and look at interface conflicts in the longue durée, we can better understand their effects on order, and we can really kind of create greater nuance when we want to understand how much conflict is brought about by those interface conflicts in the first place, how much friction is produced, or alternatively, how much order comes out of these conflicts. Now, in order to do this, we trace contestations in two vignettes on interface conflicts between international economic law and human rights. So two spheres of authority, as we define them in the overall project group. Two spheres of authority that are clearly pitched against one another, have different rationales that pull them apart, and that have increasingly produced conflicts and friction between them in specific areas. Now, we look at two of those, the World Bank and human rights, and corporate social responsibility and human rights law, both of which really running from around the 1980s up to today, so sort of several decades really, in which we try to get a view of how they have evolved over time. In both cases, the human rights claims that were brought about new, kind of that were activating norm collisions and norm conflicts in the way that Sassan has already outlined. Now, these human rights claims were initially seen as very destabilizing. So take the World Bank case. Many people thought the World Bank Authority was undermined, and kind of much of the development work of the World Bank was called into question. The World Bank rejected those claims, and friction ensued between them. And in both cases, the corporate social responsibility case as well as the World Bank case, the interface conflicts are not resolved even today. Still, we have actors on both sides that are pulling in different directions, for and against more human rights, for inclusion or exclusion, and there's no settlement. But if we see this in the broader picture, we can also see that this hasn't really caused the amount of friction that people may have expected at the beginning. We'd rather see a certain modus vivendi operating, in which there's a certain degree of accommodation. The World Bank has shifted its own policies and internal guidelines towards more respect of human rights, even if it hasn't fully accepted claims of human rights, and it's obviously in many ways deficient from the perspective of human rights activists. And in corporate social responsibility, human rights have been integrated to a far greater extent than initially, especially following the Ruggie principles on business and human rights. And even if especially the business community, is still trying to keep human rights somewhat at a distance or in certain limits. Now, the result is a continuing interface conflict on the surface, but below the surface, we see a significant transformation, even if it's a partial transformation, and even a reconsolidation around kind of this new modus vivendi, you can say. And generally, the actors involved in the areas have a very good idea about the state of affairs and the relation of the different norms. They can navigate them. So the idea that they lose a clear sense of stability of expectations doesn't really appear to be so true in these areas. All right, so that's our little vignettes really that we unfold in the paper. Now, what's the broader story here? Now, interface conflicts appear in this telling as part of a broader picture of contestatory processes. And especially they appear in an international order that otherwise has very limited ways of channeling contestation institutionally. That is especially so when you look at the legal side of things, because the hurdles for change in norms and rules of a legal nature are high and difficult to access. But obviously that is even if you think of it in a broader from institutional perspective, most processes of formally changing norms are very demanding, take a lot of time, and the majorities are difficult to achieve. So change is difficult. One way of advocating and institutionalizing change is through counter-norms or contested multilateralism, you can say. You create or draw on competing norms to challenge and irritate existing ones. Now, in the short term, this often appears as disorderly and frictious, but in the long term, it may lead to full or partial norm change, transformation, reconsolidation. And even where norm conflicts aren't fully resolved, we can see that actors learn to live with the irresolution and adjust and stabilize expectations again. So, in a sense, maybe the takeaway is contestation and conflict will always be part of international life. Now, the question is, how is it dealt with in the absence of clear institutional mechanisms and outlets? And we think that interface conflicts are one way of channeling these conflicts and initiate change processes. And they're not necessarily a worse form than other forms through which such contestation or conflict can be dealt with. They should be seen in the broader picture over time, and especially, I think, it shouldn't be compared to an idealized alternative of conflict-free situations in which there's only one institution or set of norms governing an issue area, because that is rather unrealistic. So overall, fragmentation and regime complexity may not necessarily lead to more friction. They may express underlying social political conflict and contestation. And the interface conflicts that we focus here in the research group, rather than creating disorder themselves, may actually be, sometimes at least, potentially productive of a new order, depending on how actors are able to realign or create a new modus vivendi around them. I'll leave it at that. I had to be brief. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for keeping the track of the time and also giving such an informative and interesting overview of the whole entire issue in only 40 minutes. So with that, I would like to open the question and answer session, and I will also stop the recording right now. So please feel free to add any comments or questions, putting them into the chat box or raising your hands. Thank you again. I'm opening the questions and answer session. Right.